Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first Innovyze Water Talks of 2021. Hope you all out there had some rest, maybe over the holidays, some time off, hopefully, um, and a happy new year to everybody out there. All right, we'll give a few more seconds to folks joining here, but again, the topic for today is tips and tricks for SQL query management, specifically within our products, kind of like InfoWorks ICM, InfoAsset Manager, and just kind of all the different ways to use SQL queries within those tools. All right. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know Nathan's mentioned, we might have 2 or 3 hours of content and stuff for you today that we're going to be trying to condense into 1 hour. So a lot to get through, and hopefully all very educational for you all out there. So again, our hosts kind of today for this Water Talks are myself, Tim Medeiros. I've been a solution engineer and I've been with Innovyze for about 4.5 years now. I'm calling in from just north of Denver, Colorado. Yeah, super excited to be with Nathan here presenting this topic. Nathan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm also solutions engineer, 5.5 years with Innovyze. I have worked a bit with ICM, and just over the years, I've always found and kind of snagged and gathered various examples of SQL queries because I found it hard to find good training, but whenever I'd find good examples I could learn from, I've just been growing this library, and it's been a fun side project, and so I've been wanting to share them with in a water talk type form. So looking forward to getting into the content today.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff Nathan's prepared today. Looking forward to getting into it with you all. Before we do get into everything though, just a bit of a housekeeping, a little bit of introduction for everybody. Again, if you haven't been to one of our water talks before, the goal really is to create more of a community within kind of Innovyze network, if you will. And we really do want to focus on your questions. Your questions do certainly provide a lot of guidance to what we do in this coming hour. Now, we do have a lot of topics, a lot of SQL queries to get to this coming hour. So we might be doing a little bit more presenting than question and answer for this particular Water Talks, but still type in all your questions. We want to hear your feedback. We've had an overwhelming amount of registration for this particular Water Talks, kind of 3 times our normal amount. So we definitely do want to hear from you. We do want to get that feedback, whether it's in the questions there or in the exit survey at the end. That's kind of that last bullet there. Don't forget that exit survey. We do want to hear from you all about what you thought of that talks, how we can continue to help you all with SQL queries in the future. A couple other things just relating to Water Talks in terms of upcoming schedule. All the rest of the January Water Talks are online on our website right now. If you go to Innovyze and you go to events and you go to Water Talks, you can find all the upcoming January ones here again, all at the same time, same day. The last one, I guess the 2 upcoming are related to swim and kind of storm sewer flood modeling. And that last one there, we will be doing a customer presentation using InfoWater and unidirectional flushing. And then there are probably a whole lot of ICM users in on this call, I imagine at least. We'll see from the questions. Hopefully, letting you know where you're all coming from. But we will have 3 ICM customer presentations coming up from February 16th to March 2nd. Kind of keep those on your radar as well. They'll be on the website for you to register for in the coming weeks here. All right. So very excited to kind of unveil those as well. But with that, again, we do have a lot to get into. So I'll just do a little introduction on SQL origins, and then I'll turn it over to Nathan here. So SQL queries, SQL is the topic for the hour today. And what is SQL? It is structured query language. It's one of the earlier kind of programming languages out there, created by IBM in the 1970s. And it is, as I was kind of doing this little bit of background, it is pronounced SQL. When I first joined Innovyze, it was SQL. Is it SQL? It is SQL is the official way to go, I guess. But it was created by IBM, kind of adopted by Oracle, who has used it as a kind of very popular form of relational database management. Oracle kind of made it so big that it was adopted internationally as the main language by kind of those worldwide standards organizations. And so when that happened, There all these other companies kind of popped up that all had their different kind of dialects and different forms of that SQL language here. So very useful tool to understand, can be used in a lot of different applications. It is kind of the go-to for relational database management, even though recently there have been some, NoSQL databases that have popped up, and there's some benefits and pros and cons to those, I would say, compared to SQL databases. SQL databases do a great job of organization, schema, kind of setting those standards, whereas NoSQL is kind of more horizontally driven, and it has some performance kind of benefits there. But SQL is here to stay for sure. And just based on the kind of popularity of you all registering for this topic, that was pretty evident to us here at Innovyze. So with that, just a bit of background on what we'll be talking about today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nathan for the main bulk of today's presentation.
All right. Yeah. SQL, it's just so pervasive as the language for interacting with data. So like if you are building your career off of interacting with data of any type, it's definitely a worthwhile language to get familiar with. I mean, even GIS uses SQL queries quite a bit. So for today, we're talking about SQL in the InfoWorks platform. There's many dialects of SQL. Unfortunately, SQL Server syntax is going to look a little bit different than in InfoWorks. There's pros and cons. So we're going to cover lots of examples to get you equipped to be able to write your own queries. And let's see. So my background is using it in ICM. Generally, I find a lot of ICM modelers that I've interacted with, sometimes they skip over SQL because it's not, it's not necessary. So a lot of my examples, I apologize for others in the audience, but it's pretty biased heavily towards ICM. It's also heavily used in InfoAsset Manager. I think on the asset side, it's a bit more intrinsic in the core workflows that people do with that product. So generally, if you're using InfoAsset Manager, you probably already know SQL queries reasonably well. Tim has some background in that, so definitely jump in if you have questions and we can try to get to those. It's also used in WS Pro, and neither of us have much experience with that because there's very few users in the North America market with it. So we're not going to cover it in WS Pro, but I do want to make sure that you know. I'm just going to show one quick thing in WS Pro that I think is really cool. This is WS Pro, and if you want to get into SQL queries, so when you right click and you create, what am I looking for? Stored query group. They added this cool feature where you can check this box to load factory queries, and it then comes preloaded with a library of many different example SQL queries that you can use for managing your data, which I think is an awesome idea. If you open up some of these, you'll see it says contributed by Scottish Water to version 5.0. Thank you, Scottish Water. I think it'd be awesome if we had the same kind of capabilities in ICM and InfoAsset Manager, where users can submit queries that they find useful to Innovyze, and so long as it's generic enough, we then bake it into the installer. I've suggested that to our product management. It hasn't gone very far, but I think if there's a lot of people from this water talk that voiced their opinion on our user voice portal, we could maybe get that into some of our other tools. But just so you know, if you are in a WS user, you can actually find lots of good examples in this pre-built library to kind of jumpstart your usage of the code. So that's all I'm going to show of WS Pro. Mostly I'm going to be showing examples in ICM. And what are the things you can do with SQL? Well, you can, and this is just some of my library that I've been accumulating over time. So SQL can be used to select stuff. You can really hone in exactly on what your selection, what selection you want to use. You can generate tables. This is one of the core uses in many other database platforms. It's basically just generating a view of data from your database. So you can generate tables, you can edit data, and you can create and delete objects. So there's really a lot you can do with it. There's not a lot of huge limitations. You can't import data. That's something you could do with Ruby scripts, which could maybe be a future topic of a water talk. But for now, we're just going to be manipulating data that's already in the database. All right, so jumping into selections. This is kind of what the UI looks like. There's various buttons you can use if you want to. We're not going to really cover the UI as much in this water talk. I'm going to mostly just dive into the language, because the UI is really just to help you write the language. It is important what object type you choose, and this field drop-down list is always very useful. But many of these other things, it's really just what you type is what it's going to do. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So if you just type conduit width greater than 24 for our North America or US users, it's going to select pipes that have a pipe diameter of greater than 24 inches. You can accomplish the same thing by saying select where conduit width greater than 24. And I'm not sure what happened to my underscore, but that should be there. So so that the full, the explicit expression, you'd say select where some kind of clause. If you leave that out, ICM is going to know what you're trying to do. So some different commands are select where. You could deselect, you could select selected. So if you already have one selection, then you want to sub-select from that, you can select selected. You can also select from if you want to select from other object types, and you can clear selection. So with these, you can combine these to really, hone in on exactly what you want your selection to be. And you can also do multiple lines. You always have to have a semicolon if you're doing multiple lines. So here we're going to say clear selection, and then we select where conduit width is greater than 24. So we're going to replace our selection just with these larger pipes. And we can also further isolate it using and or statements. So we say and the solution model is full. So these are your gravity mains with a large diameter. And you'll notice we're typing, and it doesn't really say anywhere that we're selecting from pipes. That's accomplished with this drop down where we say object type all links. You can do that with the code itself. So you could also with your code select pipes and nodes and valves, whatever else you want to accomplish all in one script. So to do that, you say select from and all nodes where chamber area is less than 12. So these are like maybe any nodes that are a little bit too small of a size or something like that. So you can select from multiple tables. If you leave this out, it's going to assume you're selecting from this dropdown up there. And you can also do text matching. So you could say select where your asset ID matches, and then you could enter any kind of text. So my 2-year-old likes pandas right now, so I just said panda. And if you do wildcards with a .*, this is going to find any asset ID that has panda anywhere within the asset ID, either with 0 or many characters before or after it. So you can find much more details in the help file on the syntax. We don't have time, obviously, to go into the syntax of everything. We're just kind of covering some of the capabilities. And also, SQL is case insensitive in ICM. So it really doesn't care if you use caps or not. I like to stick with a convention because it makes it easier for me to understand it down the road. So I stick with all caps for any generic SQL commands like select, from, where, update, etc. But for the actual field names, I leave it as lowercase just because that's how it comes populated in ICM. So you can choose a format. And actually, since this is my first slide or first content, I forgot I should mention, I prepared a file share that has the PowerPoints in PDF format and a SQL query script So all of the queries that I'm showing in this presentation and all of the examples that I'm going to show in ICM later, you can download them from that file share. And we can see if we can break our file share with having all of the attendees download at the same time. But so you can follow along with any of these. I didn't give like models to test it with, but there's a handful of examples, so you can follow along if you want. All right, and another useful thing is generating tables. So maybe you want to analyze your database and pull out certain records that match cases. So we covered select where conduit width greater than 24. That will create an object selection. But if we insert one or more fields, like say select conduit length where conduit width greater than 24, so long as there's a field in there, instead of selecting objects, it's going to create a table for you that just pops up within the UI. You can review it, you can sort it, you can copy and paste it to Excel, and that's going to just give you all of your lengths for your large diameter pipes. And you could comma separate to get multiple columns of data. You can also say order by the conduit width, ascending or descending. So you can get tables like that. If you're doing this on a regular basis, maybe you want better column headers. So you can say select OID as pipe ID, and then now you're going to get pipe ID as the header. And maybe if you're doing this on a regular basis, you also maybe want to use comma and just return to the next line. So you can have multiple lines so that that makes it just easier to organize your script. And if you have to comment out or remove columns or add columns, you can easily do that when it's all arranged like this. And you can also use a group by function. So you could say select sum on the conduit length, and then we group by the width. So what this does is it adds up all of the pipe length grouped by different diameters. So this is an example of that table. So for 30, this is all my 30-inch diameter pipe, and that totals 29,000 feet. And so that's useful. But what if we want to do a table like this, but we want to group it by a field that is more continuous, such as surcharge, or something where it doesn't fit into easy bins? What if we want to define our own bins? You can do that using the R-index function. I hadn't used this much myself, but it's definitely useful. And so this is the syntax. You'd say, you create a list, and we'll come back to lists later, but you say list, and you can define your list from 0.3 up to 2 for surcharge state. And then we're going to say select the count. So we're just going to count the number of pipes in each bin. And then we just use title R-index, the surcharge results, and then those bins. And that's going to come up with a table. So you can see that all of your pipes with a surcharge value of 1, so they're full, there's 33 of them, but 3 of them are full, and the current flow exceeds the theoretical flow from Manning's equation. So these would be pipes that are actually hindering the flow upstream. And you'll notice this sim got highlighted in pink. That happens in ICM when you have a subtable that's joined. So this is one of the powerful things of SQL, is that you can join different tables as you're querying out data. And in most databases like SQL Server, this actually requires a bit of code to do inner joins where you have to join things together within all of the InfoWorks databases. The nice thing is that these tables are already pre-joined for you. So if you have results, you can then just query those, the flow, the velocity on those pipe diameter, with your actual pipe data. And so there's joined tables, and this is really common, especially with asset data. So Tim is going to show some examples from InfoAsset Manager where you could, interact with these joined tables.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So yeah, the kind of built-in joins, like Nathan was mentioned, particularly useful in InfoAsset Manager because you want to be able to relate your pipe to your CCTV survey to all the defects from that CCTV survey. Not just surveys, but you've got repairs, you've got cleans, you've got incidents, you've got properties, you've got all those downstream manholes and everything like that. So with it, kind of to some basics of SQL, what you're seeing there on the left in that GIF is the main InfoWorks SQL interface. And so you can select all those objects that you have within your database with that top drop down. And then the middle drop down that's being highlighted, you can relate your, stop playing, but you can relate your main object to any of its related fields. And then you can relate, go from that related table to any of its fields. So in this case, we're looking at a CCTV survey, the details from the CCTV survey, and then looking at, in particular, that PACP, that defect code there. All right, so there it goes. Playing again. All right, so examples of this we can show in InfoAsset Manager. Again, if there's interest, or maybe you want to find the pipes, but you need to see the relationship from pipes to pipe repairs there. So you can say, find pipes, and then query on the pipe repairs related to those pipes, whether those pipe repairs were completed or closed. We can kind of go further, and we can say, okay, I've got a particular pipe, I want to relate it to all the other pipes. So we can do something where we look at, count how many pipes are downstream of a particular pipe, and you get a full table where you see, the pipe ID and then the number of downstream or upstream pipes there. So it's relating, I guess, pipes to many other pipes. And then finally, kind of like the example is showing there. There we go. So we can do, things like, okay, we've got our pipes selected. Let's count, from all the CCTV surveys. Maybe there's been 4 CCTV surveys done on that particular pipe. Let's count the number of defects from all of those CCTV surveys, roll them up to that particular pipe, or maybe count a specific type of survey. So here we added a where clause where that type of defect is CC defect, cracked circumferential there. So a lot of different things you can do within InfoAsset Manager with these SQL queries. Again, if you're out there and you're looking at SQL queries for asset management, definitely a lot of things you can do. This tool is very central to the database there.
All right. So a lot of the examples that I'll end up showing in the software require editing data, which is really powerful. So it's pretty straightforward. You can use the set command. So you can say set flood type equals stored. This will just update all nodes to use stored as the value of the flood type field. But if you want to be more specific, you could say update selected and do that same command. So maybe you select a handful of nodes ahead of time and then you perform that operation. Or you could also set X equals Y where certain conditions are true. Here's one example that's useful in real life. So here we're going to select nodes that have a missing chamber floor, at basically the invert elevation. So select where chamber floor is null or chamber floor is 0. These are 2 different cases where you're missing the data. And then so first we select it semicolon, and then we say update selected, set the chamber floor equal to the min ds links dot upstream invert. So this will select the minimum elevation from the downstream links and their upstream invert. So if you have multiple pipes, it would grab the upstream invert of all of those downstream pipes. And you'll notice good practice to do, certainly not required, but I don't end it there. I do a comma, and then I also update the corresponding flag. So if my query is going around changing data for me, filling in gaps where I'm not manually doing it, I probably also want it to record what it's doing. And you can do that in InfoWorks using data flags, which is really cool. So if you haven't done that before, any field that you update, you can just add the field name underscore flag, and then that's the flag for that field. And you can define it, and then you just set it to your string that is the flag. So in my database, I use INF as an inferred data flag. And so that means I'm kind of making a guess what that node invert is. So here's another example where I've seen models where maybe you still have manholes connected to your pressure mains, and in InfoWorks ICM, it's recommended that you use break nodes on pressure mains. And so here is an example query where you could achieve that. So first we clear the selection, and then we select where the downstream links, and this is on the nodes table. So the downstream links of any node and the solution model field of those downstream links, if it equals pressure or the downstream link solution model equals force main, then we select those. So we're going to select any node that has the downstream pipe as a pressure main or force main. And then the next statement is we update those nodes and we set them to equal node type of break. And we're also going to update the node type flag so we know what we've changed using the query. So this will kind of auto assign all of your nodes that have a downstream pressure main to make sure that it's a break node. And that's, these are quick, easy tasks to make sure that your model makes sense. Along with updating data, it can be really useful to update temporary fields where maybe you don't have a field for where you want to store data, but you want to use it. So you can do that in SQL. You just add a $sign and then any field name you want. You can come up with your own field name. So one example that I've used this code snippet for is maybe if my nodes have changed, maybe some subcatchments don't drain to a node anymore, or maybe the node they drain to is missing. So here's an example where I update the nodes table and I set subcatchments temp equal to 1. And you'll notice subcatchments is pink. So we're updating the nodes. And so this is the joined subcatchments to each node. And we update, we're just going to assign a temporary field on the subcatchments. We don't have to update a user number or user text field. We're just going to do a temporary field, set it equal to 1. So any subcatchment with a node is going to get 1. And because we've now created temp, any subcatchment that doesn't have a 1 means that it doesn't have a corresponding node. So then the next line, we just select from the subcatchment now where temp is not equal to 1. This will select all of my subcatchments that don't have a corresponding node. And then we can then just flag all of those. So we say update selected subcatchment, set node ID flag equal to whatever flag. And then here is another example. This is later on in a more involved example that I'll get to later, but you can also use these temporary fields with calculating your results. So here is an example I have later where I want to grab the average velocity during certain hours of the day. So maybe I want the average velocity from 7 a.m. until 12 p.m. So you can actually say set speed, come up with your own temporary variable equal to the average. You can use an if statement. And then the TSR is the subtable of results that includes all of your time series results. And so here we're, this is a bit complex of an example, but just to give you a feel of what you can accomplish, we're averaging out all of the upstream velocities, but we're only using the values that are in between these certain time steps. And if not, it's going to be null, so it's not going to be included in the average. And then you can update that speed later on. So you can say, update speed where the speed is less than the min speed. And we can also call that speed later with later on calculations like updating the travel time through each pipe by taking the length divided by the speed to get the travel time. There's a bit more stuff going on here that I don't really have the time for, but temporary fields are pretty useful. And I see some handful of questions coming in. I'm going to try to get through the slides quick, and then we'll take a look at some slides. So in addition to updating data and selecting data, you can also create and delete data, create and delete objects. So deleting is simple. You can just say delete selected from, or you could just say delete from table name where. And you can also create data by saying insert into the table name, you define the fields, and then you say values, and you define the values. And this is something I mostly accomplish using loops. And so this is something we'll see later on in some examples that were also in the file share. But generally, you'd create some kind of loop, and you'd say insert into 2D point source. We need the ID, the X and the Y, and then we define the values, and that's coming from my list function, and then these two scalars that we got. And then kind of my last content slide, you'll notice we've covered the set command, how you can define new fields. Here I'm defining a let statement where I'm saying let I equals 1. So what is that? Obviously, I is just this counter value that's going up 1 each loop. So what's the difference between let and set? It's very important. I wasn't trained on it, and I was confused by it initially until I eventually figured it out. So I wanted to explain it. So there's fields and there's scalars and there's lists, and it's really important that you understand the difference. So if I say set cat equals meow, that's a temporary field. So imagine a table of all of my pipes, and now it's like we've just added a column called cat, and now every pipe has a value of meow in that column. So that is a field. So this is a temporary field for all rows of a current table. If I say let fox equals, we don't really know what the fox says. So if you use the let command, it's not a field, it's going to be just a temporary scalar, is what we call. So it's just a variable that's just floating. It's a single value, and they're very useful, but it's not a field. So you can use this. You could use this later on to update your nodes, you can use it in if statements. You can do it in different things, but there's an important difference. And there's also lists. So you could say list animals. It could be strings. It could be a list of values, of numbers, and so on. And so how do these interact? Well, you can update your field from a scalar, and that's pretty easy. You just say set kitten equals fox. That's approved. ICM is going to be happy with that statement. But what I've tried to do before is I want to let my fox equals kitten. And ICM is going to complain, or InfoAsset manager is going to complain at that. Because if you recall, this is a field of which there's many values of cat or kitten, but there's only one fox. So you can't use an equal statement. So what you have to do is you have to say select kitten into fox, and you have to use a where clause to select only one of, the names the silly names I've chosen are probably confusing, but so you use select into to move data from a field into a scalar. And this is really powerful because if you need to move data from pipes to TVD connectors or to some kind of new object like nodes or something else, if it's not pre-joined in the database, the only way to move that data is you can move it from one table into the scalar into the next table. So that's how you can update data from one object to another. And you can also move data from fields into lists, and you use the same syntax, but you need to include the distinct function or the distinct command. So you just say select distinct pipe ID into your list. And so there's examples in my queries that I'm going to show. So I'm going to get into the software soon, and I wish I had an hour for what I've I've kind of prepared, but I'm going to try to cover a few different tips and tricks as we jump into the software. Let's maybe take a quick break and address questions. Tim, have there been some questions come up that we should address?
Yeah, there was a good one up here. Hold on. I loved the response about what the fox says from Craig about those. Some people remembering your reference there from, what was that, like 2011, that song? Um, anyways, is there a way to integrate call pre-made selection lists with SQL? I thought that was a good question. Thanks, Evelyn, for that. Um,
Yeah, no, that unfortunately not. Yeah, ICM or yeah, I exchange can do that, but yeah, unfortunately not. So yeah, that could maybe be a feature request on user voice, but yeah, otherwise, yeah, you'd have to mark those objects with like a user number, user text field in some way.
Yeah, so you could still do it all in one query, right? In the first half of the query, it could be, select pipes of diameter this or select those that are within, X reach or intersecting this property, and then I guess call them, I guess. Yeah, it would just all be within the SQL query instead of calling a selection list, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, SQL queries can't interact with selections.
Yeah. And we had a couple questions here about kind of probably from one-time users. Remember in the ICM user forum or looking for a library with SQL scripts. For those folks, I'd say let us know in the kind of survey at the end here, what would be the best way? I mean, we're presenting a 1-hour webinar on SQL queries, and Nathan said he could go on for 2 or 3 hours. We probably, Nathan's probably been doing SQL queries for hundreds, if not thousands of hours maybe. So, there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot you can do with the tool. So one of the questions in the survey is how can we best, help you with this really flexible, really powerful tool within, not only our store storm flood ICM product, but also our asset management, also WS Pro for water distribution modeling. How can we help you kind of harness these very powerful tools? So, we're rolling out a learning series. We're doing water talks every week. We can get that forum going again. Nathan's, posting things on GitHub all the time. What way works best for you all? That's one of the questions in that exit survey there. But yeah, we'll certainly be doing probably another water talk following up on this. But please do let us know. And then if you're a user, you can always email support@innovyze.com. Say, I'm trying to figure out how to do X, Y, and Z, with queries, and we certainly have staff to help with that. Yeah, Nathan, anything you'd want to add to that kind of idea?
Um, yeah, yeah. I've started my own GitHub, and but yeah, I've also suggested to Innovyze to start up an Innovyze GitHub repository where many users can contribute. That can be a great way to even just get recognition for yourself. I also like the idea of the factory loaded SQL queries in WS to make that accessible in ICM would be great. But yeah, at the moment that old forum, I think it had kind of passed away, or I think it's still out there, but yeah, it's not active anymore.
Do you want to take more questions, Nathan? Or do you want to go into the
Yeah,
software there?
yeah. I'll jump into the software to show some things. Someone did ask. I provided an ICMT file with the download, and it is in the latest version of ICM. So I'm using ICM 2021.1. So you probably won't be able to access that transportable database, but I did put everything into an SQL script. So you can open this in like a notepad, and everything. So all of the scripts used in the PowerPoints are in this first section. You can kind of see them labeled, and then here, starting at line 70, this is where I'm going to start jumping into examples that I'm going to show in the software, and you can kind of see like number 6. So Sorry, my mouse is kind of being funny. So number 6, you can see that the title of the query, and you can just copy and paste this into ICM, and you just run it on object type all links with that name, and then you'll have kind of the same capabilities of what I have here. So I have a few different models, and I have 13 kind of example SQL queries that start simple and get pretty complicated, or somewhat more complicated. I don't have time to go over all of them, unfortunately, and each of these kind of have a unique story of why I've created them. So we'll probably have to come back to these in the future. Let's see. So a couple tips and tricks. I'm going to move this slide to my other screen so I can talk quickly on these. So some tips and tricks. I need to go to webinar out of the way so I can read my own secondary monitor. So definitely some important things to know that you probably know if you haven't, but whenever you're writing SQL queries, you can press F1, you can get to this help file, and this first page that you get to is probably not super helpful, but the SQL syntax is where I always go. This is very, very helpful, namely the supported syntax, and these functions are very helpful, especially if you're going to start getting into the lists, the list functions. These are all very very helpful. So just a really good reference to point back to. And if you want more meat, there's also SQL in ICM or whatever platform you're using. And this gives you a more in-depth description on these different topics that we're kind of skimming over today. Today is kind of just to give you a quick orientation and then to give you a library of some different examples just to stir your creativity of what you may want to achieve. So that's the help file. One useful trick I didn't realize my first several years of interacting with ICM, but there's going to be times where you're working with SQL, you're creating selections, and then maybe you want to review the properties of what you're editing. Did you know you can press F2 and that will toggle in between the select and the properties tool? So like the dilemma I always had was I'd be selecting multiple things, and I'm always too lazy to go up and click in the toolbar to get the properties. And so I would just double click to get the pipe, to get the properties, and you can double click the node to get the node properties. So I generally always stay on the select cursor, and you just double click if you want properties. So if you didn't know that, that's one piece of advice. But sometimes you have selections and you want to access properties, but you don't want to modify your selection. For that, you can press F2, and then and you can keep appending to your selection. You can press F2. You can get properties of different things, and so that's useful. And also just generally when you're going in between tools, like if you're on the long section profile pick tool, then if you want to get back to the select tool, you can just press F2 twice and you can get back to select. And you can also, in case you didn't know, even within your profile, you can press F2, pull up properties on different objects, and you can sub-select things from your profile, and you can right-click and say create from selection. So those are just a couple quick things in case you didn't know. You should be aware of that, and you can expand your selection, just say create from selection, and there you go. So that's using the F2 key. There's also a few cases where you may want to be working by writing queries that access results, and maybe you want to actually write the things you're analyzing as temporary fields to the network that you're working with. That's really powerful in a few different cases. So the way that you do that, and I have some examples where you do it. So to be able to write queries that work on results, but also edit the network at the same time, in case you didn't know, you can open just a network itself so that it's editable, and then you drag the results on top. That way, the network is editable and you can access the results. And so then you can write to your user number fields, your user text fields, and you can also do that with creating themes and so on and so forth. So just note, you can open the network, you drag the results on top, and then you can run your query, and there's a lot you can do with that. All right, and then all right, so I'm gonna jump into a few examples now. That way we only have 15 minutes left. Dang. Okay, so first real quick example is just in case you've ever needed to ensure that you have unique asset IDs on your objects, on your different pipes, for example. So I'm just going to select link type. I'm going to get the count, and I'm going to group by my asset ID, and I'm going to order by the count descending. So if I do this, this creates a table for me where I can see all of the different unique asset IDs and the link type and the number of times it occurs. And so these are non-unique asset IDs in my network. And this can happen if you ever do things like I sometimes do, where I insert a node into a pipe. Like if you insert a node and you split the pipe, it's convenient because it keeps your invert elevations and does things for you. But what happens is that both pipe segments are going to keep that same pipe asset ID. So just that's just one quick thing. My next example, I think I saw there's a question on selecting orphan objects, orphan nodes. I've seen this sometimes in stormwater networks where you have where users will have floating nodes in the middle of nowhere, not really doing much. So this is an example leveraging those joined fields because the database has some of those connectivity joins built in, like nodes. You can select downstream links and upstream links. So this one is going to select where the count of downstream links is 0 and the upstream links is 0. So if you have a node floating in the middle of nowhere, it's going to get selected. So if I run this query, it selects those two nodes. Likewise, you could double backspace to comment out this line, and then this would just select all of your nodes that have no, select where the downstream links is 0. This should select any nodes that basically your downstream outfall, or if you did only the upstream links 0, that would be all of your upstream nodes. All right, those two examples are really quick. Let's get into just show a couple spatial queries.
There was one, I think there's actually a question here that perfectly fell in line with that. So is there a SQL query for spatially updating all links or all nodes based on a selection of polygons?
All links based on a selection of polygons.
So you'd have the polygon selected and.
Yeah, so yeah, let's talk about spatial joins. So one example I have prepared happens to be the next one. And this was a use case where I want to where I'm going to join objects to the nearest object. So this example is where I'm raising buildings up above the ground. If I did a real quick 3D view of this 2D area, what I'm doing is I'm just extruding the buildings above ground so that rainfall will fall off the buildings and it will be diverted around the buildings. We've got a lot of vertical exaggeration going on here. Let's set that to like 3. So here all my buildings are above the ground. And that is currently being achieved in this model. Let that close. That's currently being achieved just by simply raising the elevation on mesh zones by 20 feet. And so that's going to take the existing ground elevation, raise it 20. Let's say I instead want flat buildings. So here's an example where instead of using raise 20 feet, I want to set it equal to be level, but then I need a ground elevation. So I need to know the elevation and manually like I don't, the polygons themselves don't have the ground elevations, but it doesn't need to be precise. So here I'm just going to get the ground elevation from the nearest node. So I'm going to just say I'm updating my mesh zone. And whenever you activate this, so by default, the spatial search is inactive, but if I go to nearest, now it's going to do a spatial join. So I can say the nearest node within 150 feet. And then you can call really any of those node fields by just saying spatial, and then you can call the field from the node. So we're just going to grab the node elevation plus 20 as my estimate. And so when I run this, and this is only the selected polygons, so if I select those, I can apply it. And then if I go back to my F2 key, so now this one is using level, and now I have an elevation. And if I undo, so it's kind of doing those two commands for me. So joining to the nearest object, you do it like this. But I have another example. So if instead I wanted to update objects from the polygon that it's inside, what you would do is you could say you'd be updating mesh zones or pipes, for example, and then you'd say inside, and you could then point at your polygon layer, which is down here, and so then you could pull data from your polygon. And the polygon doesn't have much data, but it has like a bunch of user text and user number fields. So I imagine that might be how you would do it. So you could say inside would be the case for that. And another example that I think is interesting is that you can flip the direction at which SQL queries go. So or these spatial queries go. So that is joining one. So we're doing the query on the mesh zone, finding the nearest node, and we're pulling data from that node. Instead, I'm going to do a query on subcatchments where let me switch to a different network. This one's from the UK. So let's say I want to join my subcatchments to the nearest node, but I want it to be the node with the lowest elevation. So in this case, I'm actually going to reverse the direction. So let me illustrate that. So let me pull up my example for what I'm looking for. So in this case, I'm focused on subcatchments, but I'm actually going to do it in reverse order. So I'm going to query on nodes using a distance function with my network layer on subcatchments. And I'm going to say subcatchment ID, which is down here a little bit. So here I could say select where spatial subcatchment ID, and let's just pick one. I'll just take this guy, equals that. So here is a distance of, let's say 100. Bear with me 1 second. A distance to all nodes. Oh yeah, need to have an equal statement. Always fun doing things in front of an audience. So so I had this subcatchment is the ID, and so you can select multiple nodes where this is true. So you don't only have to pull data from one selected object. You can actually subselect multiple. And so this framework, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now iterate through each subcatchment. I'm going to select all of the nodes within a certain distance, and then I'm going to find the lowest elevation node and assign that to the subcatchment. And the reason for this query is if I zoom in here, you'll notice the pipes are flowing from right to left, but these subcatchments are currently assigned draining from left to right. And hydrologically, that doesn't make much sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show this example real quick I'm actually going to redo these subcatchments, how they're assigned. So I'm just going to wipe out the node ID. So that's wiped out. So they're all missing. And if I go to subcatchment within nearest distance, here we're doing a query based on distance. We're querying based on nodes, but actually we only care about the subcatchments. So that's kind of the paradigm shift here. So we're clearing the selection. We're creating a list of my subcatchments, and we're selecting the subcatchments where my node ID is missing. And then with that list of called subs, we're going to iterate through that using a while loop. And this is what many of my examples have that you'll see if you go through them. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but so we say let I, which is a scalar, equal 1. And then while I is less than the length of that list. So basically, we have a list of each of these subcatchments, and we're just going to go through them one at a time. So first I is equal to the first ID. And so for that subcatchment, we're going to select again, and we're selecting my nodes where that subcatchment ID is equal to this one from my list. And we want to make sure we don't grab outfalls if we're joining, because you can't join a subcatchment to an outfall. And then we're going to subselect. So we're selecting selected of those nodes. We're going to grab the minimum chamber floor into a scalar, and then we can select selected where that node equals that scalar. The low invert, and so on. We're also replacing null values with 0, and let's just see it in action. So if I click apply, now all of those subcatchments, instead of draining from left to right, they're draining from right to left, which is matching the direction of the flow in my pipe network. And so the way this query would be used in practice is you'd probably want to wipe out the subcatchment assignments that are missing, and then you'd want to start with a low distance, because if you do too wide of a distance, let me just undo that, and let's say 500, you might start getting subcatchments that drain way too far downstream. So, use this with care, but and work your way up with a higher distance. It's only going to fill in the subcatchments that are missing, so you can iteratively run it. And gosh, I hate to say we're running out of time, so we're gonna have to come back to this water talk in the future. Let's see, Tim, any questions that we need to address?
No, absolutely. I think, well, I mean, just SQL queries themselves, just the nature of them, I think probably demand more than an hour a year first. So we'll for sure be coming back to it. And again, please fill out the survey if you have any specific questions, specific things you're working on in ICM, in InfoAsset Manager, in WS Pro that we can focus on when we do come back to them. Would certainly appreciate that. There was one. Can you set up runs with SQL queries or with Ruby scripting?
And no, that creating runs is one task that's reserved to iExchange, that external API where you can run things from command line. So yeah, unfortunately not.
That's what I thought. If any of you are still struggling to find the file share, that should be in I think you posted it in the chat. So it's just a link there that you can click on and then download, again, all the scripts that Nathan has been sharing here. Can download some of those here. Let's see. Okay, got it. Great. Glad you found that, Olivia. All right. Good. Yeah. Can SQL queries aid the subcatchment drawing definition process in any way? Have you seen any of that, Nathan, in the past? Maybe we'll just. I mean, there are a lot of questions coming up. I mean, that might be a good one to end on.
No, no, so
You change the
generally sometimes,
assignment, but yeah.
yeah, sometimes you can find some of the associated array data, but vertices is not something you can edit or access with SQL of subcatchments. So no, there's not any queries that help you delineate subcatchments.
Okay. All right. I see a couple folks still having trouble accessing the file share again in the chat. Nathan posted that back at the 15-minute mark there. You know, we've got a lot of, Nathan shared a bunch of SQL query examples. We do, you know, while the forum has kind of petered out over time, we do have, again, the help file is a fantastic resource. Nathan showed that on the page there. There are some examples in there as well if you search the help within your working in InfoAsset Manager or ICM. Also, we do have knowledge base articles on our support portal. Can put that link in the chat here, maybe here, but there, so there are SQL examples in there as well. If you email, like I said earlier, if you email Innovyze support and say, hey, I'm trying to do X, Y, and Z, we have folks in the US, Australia, UK that can help you with that. Yeah, we can certainly, if you're having trouble with any of the links, please feel free to reach out to myself. I put my email in the chat as well as Nathan's. If you need a recording, if you want to see a recording of this video, just let us know and we can send those to you. We certainly like to keep our Water Talks live to get as much engagement as possible. So we do appreciate everyone joining live. That's why we don't automatically just share the links out. But if you do want a copy of the presentation of the webinar, we're happy to share that with you. With that, yeah, I think the couple of folks that are needing the links again, we'll follow up with you. We have your emails, but thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it, and we'll certainly be circling back on this topic in the future. Thanks, Nathan.
All right, thank you, everybody.